Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you are well today. I hope you had a nice weekend. Certainly, the weather yesterday was a lot better than we have this morning, but at any rate, I hope you are well and your families are well. If you can hear me okay, please type yes into the chat window. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so let's see here. Not much in terms of business items today. We're going to continue with chapter 12. Please be advised that the end of the semester is starting to sneak up on us a little bit. You are 2 weeks away from your next lecture exam, exam 3 on April 27th. And, excuse me, no, you are 2 weeks away from that exam, 2 weeks away from exam 3 on April 27th. And then you are 3 weeks away from your second lab exam. Even though we are not doing lab activities at this time, there is going to be a second lab exam, but it will be primarily on the reading of the lab manual for the activities. And as always, I will be giving you a study guide a week in advance so that you can really focus your study time on that. So please be advised, though, that you do have some things coming up in the near future that will be important for you. So at any rate, I hope you're doing well. Do you have any questions at this time? All right, so you're all quiet, so I hope everything is okay. I thought that today what I would do is start our class time together by showing you how to calculate your course grade. As we approach the end of the semester, it's going to be increasingly important that you be able to calculate where you stand in the class so you can make a decision about whether you want to finish the semester out or withdraw and take a W, okay? So what I'm going to do is go to a Microsoft Excel page and show you how to calculate your course grade at this time. Okay, so bear with me one moment while I share that with you. Okay, so at this point, you should be seeing a Microsoft Excel document on the screen in front of you. And so I just wanted to give you an example of how you would begin to calculate your course grade. I'm going to use some numbers that are just random, but obviously you would want to insert your own grades into this calculation. So, okay. The first thing we need to do is create some column headings of what we're talking about. So in the first column, you would list down what exam you're talking about. In the second column, you would put down the score of the exam. In the third column, you would put down the weight, which is from your syllabus, right? The front page of your syllabus. And on the fourth column, we would write down our weighted score. All right, so let's see here. All right, so in your class, you have 4 lecture exams. Lecture exam 1, lecture exam 2, lecture exam 3, lecture exam 4, lab exam 1, and lab exam 2. All right, so, okay. So the very first thing we have to do is write down your exam scores. So for lecture exam 1, you would write down the score that you earned. You would write it down not as a percentage, but as a decimal. So for example, let's say that on the first lecture exam, you scored a 68%. I don't know what you scored, but you put in your own work. Let's say on lecture exam 2, you scored a 74%. Now lecture exams 3 and 4, we have not done yet. So we'll come back to that. On lab exam 1, let's say you scored an 87%. Okay. So again, I'm just throwing random numbers in. You would put in the grades you actually earned on your exams. Now we have 2 lecture exams and a lab exam, which we haven't taken yet. Okay. And anything in yellow here means that we have to estimate what you think you can get. Okay. So for lecture exam 3, which again is 2 weeks from today, what do you think you can get on lecture exam 3? Now consider how you performed on the first 2 lecture exams and make your best estimate of how well you think you can do. So I'm going to say 80% on lecture exam 3 and 80% on lecture exam 4. Okay, you put your personal estimates in as to what you think you can do. For lab exam 2, put an estimate for what you think you can do for the lab exam. And I'll put in 90% as my hypothetical estimate at this time. Okay, now we have to include the weights of each exam, which are stated on the first page of your syllabus. Lecture exam 1 is 22%. Lecture exam 2 is 22%. Lecture exam 3 is 18%. Exam 4 is 18%. Lab exam 1 is 8%, so that's 0.08. And lab exam 2 is 12%. Okay, the weights are taken from the front page of your syllabus. To get the weighted score, you take what you have in column B and multiply by the corresponding weight in column C. So this would be B2 times C2 in the spreadsheet matrix. And that will give you the weighted score of each row. And I'm just going to use my software to finish the calculations for me. Okay. Now to get your final grade, what you do is take your weighted scores and add them all together. You add them all together. So the spreadsheet gives you a function to do that. It's called sum. I'm going to sum all of these together and boom, there we have our final grade. Our final grade for this hypothetical student would be a 78% in the course, which is a C. All right. And so this is the process you would want to perform with your own grades to figure out what kind of grade you're likely to finish the semester with. Now, as you get more grades finished, for example, after you take lecture exam 3, you can come back in and update that score, right? Let's say you ended up with an 83%. So I can put 83 in there and notice how it's going to change the final, right? It changed the final to 0.7834. So you can update your calculation through the remainder of the semester to figure out how well you're doing. Okay. Gang, does this make sense? Do you have any questions about how to calculate your potential course grade at this time? Because I don't want it to be a mystery to you. I don't want you to be shocked at the end of the semester that you ended up with a certain grade. I want you to know ahead of time that this is the kind of grade that you can expect at the end of the semester. So, folks, do you have any questions about that? Okay. Not seeing anything or hearing anything, I'll assume you're okay. If you do have questions, please send me an email and I can help you work through that with your scores so that you can confidently know where you stand in the semester. All right. Okay, gang. So I'm going to stop sharing that and ask you, do you have any questions about our schedule right now or anything going on here at HACC? Okay, everybody's quiet today, so I'll take that as though you're doing well. I certainly hope so. I know these are very stressful times. Okay, so what we're going to do is try our best to finish chapter 12 today. So I'm going to go back to a Microsoft Word document and continue to give you some notes on chapter 12 content. Okay, so bear with me just a moment. All right, so you should now see a Microsoft Word document up on the screen, as well as a chat window. Okay. All right. Here we go, folks. Let's see, at the end of last class, we had been talking about our little cartoon drawing of the heart, the Valentine's Day heart, the lungs, and the abdomen, and illustrating the pulmonary and systemic circuits to you. So what I'm going to continue with at this time is some more basic anatomy of the cardiovascular system. And so let me give you a page number that you can reference at this time. Okay. Now let's see here. Let's go with page 215. Page 215. Okay. So we're going to talk about some anatomy of the arteries, capillaries, and veins. And the first thing I want to simply define for you is a term that maybe did come up in lab at some point, but I want to be sure that you appreciate it. And that term is lumen, okay? Lumen, as you recall, is the internal hollow cavity of a structure. The inside of your urinary bladder, the open space of the bladder, is the lumen. Likewise, the inside of your small intestine, the inside of your stomach, the inside of your esophagus, the inside of your large intestine. These are lumens. They're the open hollow space. The same is going to be true for your blood vessels. The blood vessels contain an open hollow space that is referred to as the lumen. The lumen is any open hollow space inside a structure. Okay, in the case of our conversation right now, we're talking about blood vessels. Okay, blood vessels have a lumen. They have an open hollow space that allows the blood to move through the vessel. Okay, so let's talk about arteries a little bit. All right. Now, arteries, as you see on page 215, are made of 3 layers of tissue. Okay. Okay. You have, now let me see here how I want to do this with you. Okay. You have the inner layer. You have the inner layer of the artery, which is made of endothelial tissue, which is a fancy way of saying it's made of epithelium. Okay. Made of epithelial cells. Okay. You have the middle layer, which is made of smooth muscle, and in addition to the smooth muscle, you will have a bunch of elastic material, elastic fibers. There's actually proteins called elastin, E-L-A-S-T-I-N, that actually provide stretchiness to the tissue. So the middle layer is smooth muscle coupled with elastic fibers. And we have the outer layer, which is made of connective tissue. So if you think about it, you know what the four major tissue categories are. They are epithelial, muscle, connective, and nervous tissue. So arteries have three of those four tissues that make them up, right? You have an inner layer of epithelial cells, you have another middle layer of smooth muscle cells, and you have an outer layer of connective tissue, which of course is made of cells plus extracellular matrix. Okay, so a question for you, which I will put into your notes. Why is it important that arteries are made of material that allow them to stretch? Why is that important? What do you think, folks? If you know the answer, please type that into the chat window, or perhaps unmute your microphone and speak up. Why is it important that arteries are made of material that allow them to stretch? What do you think? Anybody? Okay, so Kirsten says blood pressure changes. Well, you might be onto something there, Kirsten. What do you mean? Does the stretchiness of the artery allow the blood pressure to change? Is that what you're saying? Okay. Owen is saying so they can expand for different volumes of blood. Okay, that's a good answer. Okay, why? Owen, why would it be important to expand for different volumes of blood? Why would that be important? Alexi says to let more blood enter. That is also a reasonable statement. Well, okay. There's actually two things here that I need you to appreciate. And if we combine some of your statements, we can kind of get there on most things. All right, so let's put it this way. Think about when we have a hurricane that comes up the coast of the United States. Think about a hurricane coming up the coast. When we think about the hurricane and we think about trees that are planted along the shoreline, what kind of trees can survive the hurricane? Those that are rigid and don't bend, or those that have flexibility and can bend? Which kind of tree is more likely to survive the hurricane? Those that can bend or those that can't bend?
Those that can bend.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so that stretchiness of the artery allows the blood vessel to avoid any structural damage. Okay, similarly to how a tree can flex during a hurricane, the ability to stretch allows the artery to avoid damage. Okay, to avoid structural damage. Okay. And so that gets to Owen's comment on the chat window, so that the blood vessels can expand for different volumes of blood, right? By expanding for different volumes of blood, we can avoid structural damage to the tissue. Okay. And there's another related idea that Kirsten is starting to get out. It has something to do with blood pressure. Okay. So I'm gonna put a question in the chat window and see what you folks say. Okay, here it comes. Does the ability of blood vessels to stretch help blood pressure change or help keep blood pressure constant? That last word is constant. What do you think? Okay. All right. Okay. We definitely have a difference of opinion here. If you look at the chat window, we have people saying to help blood pressure change and some saying to keep it constant. The reality of it is that the ability of blood of the arteries to stretch helps to minimize any blood pressure changes. In other words, the stretchiness helps to ensure we keep a relatively constant blood pressure. Okay. So this ability of arteries to stretch allows the blood pressure to stay the same, even though different volumes of blood are moving through the blood vessel. Okay, now let's think about that for one moment. We really want a situation in our body where blood pressure is fairly constant. We don't want it fluctuating up and down to a great extent because that's harmful to us. Think about when you're riding a roller coaster at Hershey Park or, whatever amusement park you folks like to ride roller coasters at. Think of how exhilarating it is to go down those giant dips and then go up and so forth. That's fun for a moment of time. But how would you actually feel if you had to go up and down in those dips constantly for a full hour? What if nothing was happening except you were going up and down the dips on the super duper looper for a full hour? Would you feel very good after you got off that roller coaster? I would argue that you probably would not feel good after you got over that roller coaster. What I'm suggesting to you is wide dramatic changes, wide dramatic fluctuations in your blood pressure is not something that Mother Nature wanted your body to experience. Because that creates stress on the organs and tissues of the body. So Mother Nature built your arteries to intentionally stretch so that even though the heart can push blood into the artery, the blood pressure stays relatively constant by expanding the volume of space by stretching to allow that larger volume of blood to be in. Folks, am I making sense? Are you okay right now? Do you have any questions? Okay. All right. Please feel free to. Okay, go ahead.
I kind of did have a question. This is related to the heart. What's the best way to, how do we recognize an angina, and what's the best way to take care of it?
Well, angina simply means pain in the chest. So is that what you're asking me about?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Pain in the chest could be a problem with the heart muscle, but it could also be a problem with acid reflux in your esophagus and stomach region. In other words, you can get referred pain up into the thoracic cavity that feels like a heart attack, but it's not a heart attack at all. Okay, so angina is a very, very difficult thing to deal with. If you are a person that does suffer from acid reflux disease, you can expect that you're going to experience angina. And after a while, you'll get used to the sensation so that it doesn't scare you so much anymore and you don't think you're having a heart attack all the time. Okay. On the other hand, if you're not used to that experience and you do have chest pain, then the only way to be sure that you're not in immediate jeopardy really is to go to the hospital so they can do two things. They can take blood from your body and measure it to see if you're having a heart attack. And they can also hook you up to an EKG, which is an instrument that measures the electrical rhythm of your heart to see if that is normal or not. But angina simply means pain in the chest cavity. It could be a heart problem, but it could be something that's not a heart problem at all.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Okay. All right, gang. All right, so now we know just a little bit about the arteries. I guess at this time, I should at least mention blood pressure. And I say it that way because typically we talk about blood pressure in lab. And as you know, we're not going to be doing that this semester. So let me just mention a little bit about blood pressure. Okay. Normally I would talk about this in lab, and normally you folks would actually take each other's blood pressure in lab using a sphygmomanometer. I want to encourage you, well, let me ask you this, coming through the chat window. If you know your normal blood pressure, please say yes or no in the chat window. Okay. All right. We're getting a lot of no's here, and I thank you for your honesty. That's important, gang, right? We can't make any progress if we don't have honesty. Notice how I asked that question. I did not ask you if you know what the average blood pressure of a person is. I asked you if you know what your personal normal blood pressure is, because your personal normal blood pressure might be quite a bit different from the average healthy person's blood pressure. So I want to encourage you, if you don't know what your normal blood pressure is, that after this whole coronavirus thing gets past us, that you get in the habit of measuring your own blood pressure either at the local pharmacy, CVS, Giant, places like this. They have blood pressure machines that you can often use for free, or you can purchase a blood pressure cuff that you can get a blood pressure cuff online on Amazon for probably $30 to $50, and it's a very good investment so that you have something that you can take your blood pressure with. It's important that you know your normal blood pressure, so when you're having a conversation with the doctor, things can make sense because you know what your normal is supposed to be. Okay, so so this is sort of a side conversation I wouldn't normally do with you folks in lecture. Blood pressure is the resistance to the flow of blood. The resistance to the flow of blood caused by forcing blood through arteries and honestly veins. Okay? Every time your heart contracts, it pushes blood into this narrow tube. This narrow tube is called an artery. That narrow tube constricts the motion of the blood, and that constriction of the blood flow is actually what creates the blood pressure. Okay? Now, typically, when you measure blood pressure, you typically get two numbers, systolic and diastolic. Let's see here. So systolic is the top number and diastolic is the bottom number. Okay, sorry that doesn't look formatted better, but hard to do this on the Microsoft document. So systolic over diastolic. Okay, so as a further example, typically what you would get is like 120 millimeters of mercury over maybe 80 millimeters of mercury. Okay. All right. That would be a typical average blood pressure for an average person. Again, you are not average, you're an individual. I am not average, I'm an individual. So we all have a personal normal that's going to likely be different from this average, okay? Now the systolic blood pressure, okay? This is the highest blood pressure in the artery immediately following contraction of the heart. Can anybody tell me what chambers of the heart push blood into arteries? Can you tell me that? Do you know the answer to that? What kind of heart structure pushes blood into an artery? Okay, thank you for answering, Abigail. I appreciate that. The aorta is not correct. The artery is a blood vessel. It's not a chamber of the heart. Okay, Kira's got it. It's the ventricles. That's what I'm suggesting. Okay, there's the right and left ventricle. The left ventricle moves into the systemic circuit. The right ventricle moves into the pulmonary circuit. But that's the answer to the question. Systolic pressure is the highest pressure in an artery immediately following ventricular contraction. Okay. Diastolic. Diastolic is the lowest pressure in an artery in between ventricular contractions. Okay, so if you think about it, diastolic pressure is the lowest pressure in the artery in that brief window of time when your heart is actually resting. Okay, now that resting period doesn't last very long, typically not more than a second for most people, or even less than a second. But for every heartbeat, there is a small portion of every second where the heart's not doing anything. That's going to be your diastolic pressure. Okay? All right. So, gang, do you have any questions about blood pressure? Okay. All right, so let's make the blood pressure that a side note, because I don't normally talk about it here in the lecture. And also let me note, it is important that you appreciate that high blood pressure is a silent disease, just like glaucoma was. When we talked about glaucoma in chapter 9 with the eyes, high blood pressure is also a silent disease, and it is a devastating disease, okay? So it really does matter that you get in the habit of, take your blood pressure once a month, create a personal log for yourself, and just once a month, take your blood pressure and start writing that down in your personal log. And if you see a reading that seems to be a little bit unusual, well, don't freak out, because maybe it's just a moment in time when you're feeling a little stressed or something. But then start taking the blood pressure once a day for the next 2 weeks and see if it stays high. If it stays high, hey folks, you need to get to the doctor and start having a conversation with the doctor. High blood pressure is a silent disease and very dangerous. Please get in the habit of taking your blood pressure and writing it down in a log once each month. Okay? You don't want to have your blood pressure remain high for 10 years and not know about it. It could be doing horrible damage to your body. Okay. Gang, do you have any questions about blood pressure, high blood pressure, any of those topics? Okay. Another term that I typically bring up in this conversation is that of aneurysm. Okay. Can any of you tell me in the chat window what an aneurysm is? What's an aneurysm, folks? Something with the brain. Well, it can be in the brain, Kara, but it doesn't have to be. It could be in your chest cavity. It could be in your leg. It could be in your groin. Anybody? All right. All right. Gang, an aneurysm is a blood vessel. It's usually an artery, but it could be a vein. It's a blood vessel. Madison says when a cell collapses. Well, I'm not sure what you mean by that, Madison, because if a cell collapses, that probably means the cell is dying. So you're not 100% wrong, but I'm not sure you're quite there either with that answer. But thank you for trying. An aneurysm is a blood vessel that overstretches. A blood vessel that overstretches. Think about a rubber band. The last time you've had a rubber band in your hands, think about what it would mean to stretch that rubber band so much that you could see the rubber of the rubber band start to literally tear. That's what an aneurysm is. An aneurysm is a blood vessel that overstretches. Okay. Obviously, if the blood vessel overstretches, the probability, the likelihood, the chances that that blood vessel is going to tear is increased dramatically. Okay. So everybody thinks an aneurysm is a torn blood vessel or, a blood vessel that is ruptured. No, it is not. The aneurysm is the overstretched blood vessel that then, excuse me, that then is at increased chances of breaking apart. Okay. An overstretched blood vessel is at increased risk of rupturing. And obviously, if that happens, that could be life-threatening. Okay? Let me share a little story with you. And I'll ask you to think in your own personal experiences. Do you know anybody that's ever had an aneurysm rupture? Okay? Because there are thousands, if not millions of people walking around our planet Earth with aneurysms at this very moment, and they don't even know it. Okay? It's the only time you know it typically is when it ruptures, because when it ruptures, then you got big problems. Okay. So I have an uncle that's passed away now about 10 years ago, and he was a Vietnam veteran. And during the Vietnam War, he was a tank driver, and his tank hit a landmine, and he had severe head trauma from that battle wound, and he lost the vision in I think his right eye. He lost vision in one of his eyes. Well, after Vietnam War, he came home, and unfortunately, he was in a horrible car accident and experienced another head trauma, another severe wound from the car accident. Long story short, when he went to the doctors, when he was hospitalized for the second head trauma, they noticed that he had an aneurysm in the brain. He had an artery in his brain that had overstretched. Well, the doctors told him that they could potentially repair the aneurysm through surgery, through brain surgery, but it only had about a 50% chance of success. In other words, if he went through surgery to correct the brain aneurysm, there was a 50% chance that he would walk off the table, and there was a 50% chance he would die on the operating table. So my uncle chose not to get the surgery, and he lived with that brain aneurysm for a number of years until about 9-10 years ago. One morning he got up, it was Monday morning or something like that. He walked into the bathroom to clean up like we all do. The aneurysm in his brain ruptured loose. He experienced internal bleeding in the brain. He collapsed in the bathtub, and he passed away. And that's how fast it is. Okay? So whether you survive a ruptured aneurysm really depends on which blood vessel has overstretched and exactly what part of your body the blood vessel is serving. if you have an aneurysm in your arm or leg, you can probably survive that when it ruptures, although it's going to be as painful as hell when it ruptures. But if you have a ruptured blood vessel in the brain or a ruptured blood vessel in the heart, there's basically nothing that can be done. You are going to pass away from that. Okay? So do you have any questions about aneurysms? Okay, all righty. So feel free to type things into the chat window or unmute your microphone. Okay, so let's get back to our primary conversation. We were talking about arteries, okay? Now let me talk about veins a little bit, okay? Now veins, you can see on the bottom right corner of page 215, you can see the photograph that compares an artery to a vein, okay? And you can see that. And what I'll say is that usually, typically veins, they don't hold a circular shape like the artery. If you look at the artery, you look at the artery on page 215 there, it looks like it has a roughly circular shape to it. But you know the vein doesn't have a circular shape to it. And that's because the walls of the vein typically are thinner than the walls of an artery, okay? It is made of walls that are thinner than veins, which means veins typically do not retain a circular shape. Okay. Now it's okay for those veins to be made of walls that are thinner than the arteries. That's okay because the heart never pushes blood into a vein. It always pushes blood into an artery. So the actual physical structure of the vein does not have to be as strong as an artery. This is okay because the heart never pushes blood into a vein. All right. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how blood is able to move through the veins. Okay. I'm assuming that it's obvious to you that when the heart contracts, that is the primary force, that's the primary driving force that pushes blood through the arteries, right? Blood is circulated through the arteries by heart contraction. Perhaps we should say that. Blood is circulated through the arteries by heart contraction, but blood is not circulated through the veins by heart contraction. And again, the primary reason for that is that the heart and the body was engineered so it does not push blood into a vein. That never happens, okay? So the question becomes, how does blood circulate through a vein if not by heart contraction? Okay, now the answers are in your textbook, but I'll put them in your notes at this time. Okay, first off, what you have to appreciate is that, you know, the arteries and veins are not just laying around all by themselves in your body, right? They're running through other tissue. And so the important point here is that the veins are typically running along or even in between sections of skeletal muscle tissue. So skeletal muscle tissue, when it contracts, it literally pushes on the veins, and as it pushes on the veins, it actually propels the blood forward in the structure. Okay, if you could imagine that you're using a straw to sip some milk or Coca-Cola or something, Can you imagine that you have some liquid in the straw, and at some point in the straw, you pinch the straw shut with your fingers. And then you use your other hand to pinch on top of the first section. And you kind of walk up with your fingers, pinching each section. What you would do is gradually push the soda into your mouth or the milk into your mouth. That's kind of what happens when the skeletal muscle contracts. So I'm going to say contraction of skeletal muscles helps milk blood through the veins. That's a major driver of blood circulation in the veins. And that's happening even when you're unconscious. Even when you're asleep, your skeletal muscle tissue is still gently contracting. Your nervous system gently contracts it in ways that you're not aware of. You're not conscious, right? You're asleep, but your skeletal muscle is still causing your muscle tissue to very gently contract to gently milk the blood through the veins. Okay. All right. A second thing to keep in mind is that the veins have a very large lumen. If you look at the picture on page 215, look how big that open space is inside the vein as compared to the artery. So veins have very large lumens. And what that means is there's a lot less friction preventing the motion of the blood. So whatever blood is moving through the veins experiences less resistance because of the large lumen. Large lumens reduce the friction, allowing blood to flow easier through the veins. Thirdly, you have to appreciate that if we're talking about blood moving in a vein and that vein is above your heart, like in your head or neck area, then you would have to admit that the force of gravity will actually help pull the blood along the vein down to the heart. So above the heart, gravity helps move blood toward the heart. Now, obviously, gravity is going to work against us when we're talking about moving blood in a vein that's below the heart, right? That's going to work against us. So below the heart, we rely on the skeletal muscle contraction, the large lumen, and also something called the respiratory pump. Below the heart, the respiratory pump, okay? The respiratory pump helps draw blood toward the heart, okay? I'm not going to get into the details of the respiratory pump at this time, although it is a topic for a future conversation for us. But the respiratory pump actually refers to what happens inside your chest cavity when you ventilate, which is to say when you breathe. When you breathe, the air pressure in your body actually changes. And so when you breathe, those changes in air pressure can actually be used to push blood from your legs up towards your heart. Air pressure changes inside the body associated with breathing help drive blood toward the heart. Okay, so heart contraction is the primary mechanism that moves blood through an artery. I mean, that's basically it, and that's kind of easy to memorize, heart contraction. With veins, it's a lot more complicated because there's not one thing. There's like a whole bunch of things that collectively ensure that blood is continuing to move through the veins to go back to the heart. The last thing I'll mention here is the presence of one-way valves in the veins. Okay, take a look on page 218 of your textbook, figure 12.6, and you will notice that that picture there Okay, figure 12.6a and b as well are showing you valves. There are tiny little valves inside your veins, and they work as one-way turnstiles. In other words, when blood moves past the valve closes and prevents any blood from going backwards. So the presence of these valves helps to ensure that the blood is continually moving towards the heart and it doesn't backflow. Okay. Question coming through the chat window. Here's a question. What condition occurs when the one-way valves in the veins malfunction? Can you tell me that? What condition occurs when the one-way valves in the veins malfunction? I would bet money that most of you know the answer to this, but you may not appreciate that you know the answer to this. I'm sure all of you have seen people walking around in the summertime with this condition. Anyone?
Typing.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Very good. We have the right answer. Misspelled, but we have the right answer. Okay, Kirsten got it. It's varicose veins. That's right. Varicose veins, right? When you've seen sort of bulging areas on a person's, typically the legs can be very prominent. Bulging areas on a person's legs, it is typically caused by backflow of the blood because they have at least one or more malfunctioning valves in the veins of the leg. Now that in and of itself is typically not life-threatening, but it does produce, some anatomical changes that are ugly for people to see. Okay. Folks, do you have any questions at this time? Okay. All right. If there's no questions, what I'm going to do is go on and talk to you about some heart anatomy. Okay. So let's turn to page 220, page 220 and 221. Okay. Now, honestly, we're going to take it pretty easy on you in this course. If you were in anatomy and physiology, you would have to learn basically the entire heart anatomy, and you would also have to know the pathway the blood flows through the heart. But not for our course, not for 111, okay? Because none of you have indicated an intention to go into the medical field. So I'm just going to cover some basic ideas that, everybody kind of should appreciate because, heart disease and so forth is so common in our society. All right, so let's talk about heart anatomy. All right, first off, let's mention the myocardium. Okay, the myocardium is the muscle tissue of the heart. It makes up most of the heart mass. Okay, the myocardium, which you can see, just put an eyeball on it. The term myocardium is along the right side of the page. On page 220, you see myocardium along the right side list of terms towards the bottom right. This is the heart muscle, and this is the tissue that's actually damaged during a heart attack. Okay, so question coming here in your notes. How can doctors tell you have had a heart attack by looking at your blood makeup? How can doctors tell you have had a heart attack by looking at your blood makeup? How does that work? I mean, some of you may be even working in hospital or medical settings where you're kind of aware of a certain test that's done, and we can explain to you how that works. How can doctors tell you have had a heart attack by looking at your blood makeup? Any thoughts? I mean, in my own personal experience, my grandmother, who's now passed away many years ago, she had a few heart attacks that were so minor, she didn't even know she had any heart attack. But when she was at the doctor's office and they did blood work up on her, they went in and said, "Hey, you've had some heart attacks recently. We need to take a look at things." So the heart attack can be so mild, so subtle that you really aren't aware of it. And yet the signs, the chemical signs of the heart attack show up in the blood. Do any of you know what the doctors are looking at? Okay, not blood pressure, no, but thank you. Okay, red blood count, no. That's an interesting idea, but no, that's not typically a sign of a heart attack. If you have problems with the red blood cell count, you might very well have problems with the kidneys or the spleen or liver or the bone marrow, but not the heart. All right, let's see. Let me see if I can draw this out of you. Okay. Well, okay. If you have a heart attack, okay, electrocardiogram, that's a nice idea, but yeah, even that is not what we're looking at here, Terry, but thank you for trying. Okay. Okay. When I say blood makeup in the question, I'm saying that they drew a vial of blood from your body and sent it to the lab. So that's not an electrocardiogram, right? They're taking blood from your body and doing laboratory tests on it. A heart attack causes heart muscle cells to die. And what that means is when the heart muscle cells die, they rip apart, they rip open. And all the molecules that should only ever be found inside the heart muscle are thrown out into the bloodstream. That's the first answer to the question. The labs at the hospitals have the ability to detect molecules that should never be found in healthy blood, but are only found in blood because the molecules have been deposited into the blood after the muscle cell ripped open, and kind of like a balloon popping. So the content of the muscle cell starts showing up in blood chemistry. Now, all of you folks know the answer to my next question. At least you should know the answer to my next question. What is the name of the protein that calcium binds to start skeletal muscle contraction? Ah, good. Kira. Troponin, that's right. Folks, the same thing is true for your cardiac muscle cells. Troponin is found in the cardiac muscle. It responds to calcium to allow for the sliding filament process to happen in the walls of the heart. for the heart to contract and push blood into the arteries. Troponin should only be found in the heart muscle. It should never be found in the bloodstream. So if you have elevated troponin in the bloodstream, that indicates some kind of muscle damage. Now, of course, you might have had a traumatic muscle tear as an athletic injury, and that could raise your troponin. But you know, if you're a sedentary person like my grandmother was, who isn't out running wind sprints or anything like that, and all of a sudden your troponin level in the blood goes up, the most logical thing is that there's been some heart damage. I see your question, Madison. One moment. Let me finish my thought here, Madison, then I'll answer your question. So typically, the molecule troponin is detected in the bloodstream, which suggests heart damage. Okay, so see what you folks are learning in the course. You really are learning things that are relevant to modern medicine. Okay, Madison's question, does the same thing happen with a cardiac arrest? Okay. It can happen with a cardiac arrest, Madison. If you have a cardiac arrest, that means that the heart has stopped beating. If the heart has stopped beating, you got to figure out, well, why did the heart stop beating? The heart might have stopped beating because there's an electrical malfunction. An electrical malfunction of the heart is not the same thing as a heart attack. It's not the same thing. On the other hand, maybe the electrical system of the heart is just fine and the heart did stop beating because there is a problem with the heart muscle. So it's possible that troponin levels could be elevated with a cardiac arrest, but it's not always 100% true. Okay, other questions? All right, let's keep on rolling here. All right, so we know the myocardium, endocardium. Okay, this is the thin layer of tissue that lines the cavities of the heart. Okay. We have the pericardium. All right, now, folks, the pericardium is a fibrous sac. It's actually made of 3 layers, and I'm not going to tell you what those are called right now. But it's a triple layered sac made of connective tissue that literally holds the heart in its proper position in your chest cavity. A fibrous sac made of connective tissue that holds the heart at the correct position in the chest cavity. Okay. Please appreciate that technically speaking, and being extremely anal at this point, technically speaking, the pericardium is not part of the heart. It is simply a sac that holds the heart. Okay. Okay. But I will say this. Every year, people do pass away because of internal bleeding injuries that are associated with the pericardium. And here's what I mean by that. Every year, in car accidents and things like this, you know, we have people that end up smashing their chest into a steering column. Okay. Now, hopefully that doesn't happen because hopefully the person has a working airbag. Hopefully the person has on a seatbelt. But at any point, at any rate, sometimes it does happen. And what happens is that when you slam your chest against a hard object, you can bruise the heart anatomy in such a way that the heart itself begins to leak blood. And when the heart begins to leak blood, the only place that blood can go is into the pericardial sac. And since the pericardial sac is basically a closed sac, there's not a lot of room for it to ooze anything out. Basically, the blood that's leaking out of the heart during internal injury collects in the pericardial sac, and it puts such pressure on the heart itself that the heart can't actually beat properly anymore, and basically the heart drowns in its own blood. Okay, I know that doesn't sound that pleasant. I'm sure it's not pleasant, but every day, every year, we do lose folks that are passing away through this kind of injury, where some internal trauma is causing the heart to bleed. The blood collects in the pericardial sac, and then basically the heart drowns in that blood. Very unpleasant way to go. Any questions? All right. Number 4. Let's take a look at the atria. Okay, the atria are the upper chambers of the heart which always receive blood into the heart. Okay. The atria do not push blood out of the heart. They are not responsible for that. They're only responsible for collecting blood coming back into the heart, either through the pulmonary circuit or the systemic circuit. Okay. The lower chambers of the heart, which some of you answered in the chat window already, are the ventricles. The ventricles are the lower chambers, and they are responsible for pushing blood throughout the body. The lower chambers of the heart, which push blood throughout the body. Okay? The ventricles, if we had to talk about it, the ventricles are, the walls of the ventricles are myocardium tissue, right? They're made of heart muscle. So these are massive things that are very powerful, very, very strong muscle chambers. Okay. I also want to point out the valves of the heart, because people often have valves of the heart that go bad and you might have heard somebody that went in to have heart surgery to replace a defective heart valve. Well, exactly what are we talking about here? Okay, so we have the valves of the heart. There's basically, the purpose of the valves of the heart is always to ensure that blood is moving in the correct direction and preventing backflow. Okay, so their function is to prevent blood backflow. We don't want that to happen. And there's 2 types of ventricles. There are atrioventricular valves, atrioventricular valves. These kinds of valves are located in between each individual atrium and its connecting ventricle. For example, there is a valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle. There's a valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Okay. For example, in your textbook, page 220, figure 12.7, notice there on the left side of the page, it tells you about the right atrioventricular valve. And on the other side of the page, it talks about the left atrioventricular valve. Please understand that left and right in your book is not the left and right as you look at it, but it's the left and right from the patient's perspective, right? Left and right are always talked about in anatomy from the patient's perspective. So those are valves. Now, if you ask yourself, well, what do they really look like? Take a look at figure 12.8 on page 221, and you can see an example there of a typical atrioventricular valve. Okay, it kind of looks disgusting, but that's really what our bodies are made up of. Okay, also, this gives me a moment to mention something that you might be interested in. When you look at the atrioventricular valve, either on page 221 or in the drawing on page 220, do you notice that the valves are connected to the wall of the heart by these little thread-like strings called chordae tendineae? Notice the chordae tendineae. Gang, these are your heartstrings. So every Valentine's Day, when your boyfriend or girlfriend or significant other is tugging on your heartstrings, this is literally the anatomy of the heart that they are tugging on. Okay? And the purpose of these chordae tendineae, these so-called heartstrings, is to prevent the flaps of the valve from everting, which means turning inside out. Purpose of your heartstrings is to prevent the heart valve flaps from turning inside out. That would not be a good thing. By inside out, let me give you an analogy. Have you ever been outside on a rainy, windy day with an umbrella where the wind was so strong it caused your umbrella to turn inside out? Well, if you've experienced that, which I did recently and it pissed me off, then you know what I'm talking about. The heartstrings are trying to prevent that from happening. Okay, think about an umbrella in a windstorm. Okay, so at any rate, we have atrioventricular valves. They are positioned between the atria and ventricles, and their job is to prevent backflow. Then we also have the semilunar valves. Okay, the semilunar valves are located between each ventricle and its attached artery. Okay. All right. So let's see here. We're almost out of time, but let me mention a couple other things that you might be interested in. Let me talk about the pacemakers of the heart. Okay. The pacemakers of the heart are groups of cells in the heart that help establish the coordinated electrical rhythm of heart contraction. Groups of cells that generate electrical signals to stimulate coordinated muscle contraction. Okay? You actually have 3 pacemakers in your heart. Believe it or not, Mother Nature gave you triple redundancy with this. That's how important this is, and it cannot screw up or you die. Well, the primary pacemaker of the heart is located on page 224, figure 1212. Page 224, figure 1212, the primary pacemaker of the heart. Please just give me like 2 minutes and I can get this finished. The major pacemaker of the heart is the sinoatrial node, the so-called SA node. Okay, this is a group of cells in the right atrium. Okay, this is the primary pacemaker of the heart. It is responsible for generating electrical signals which then propagate throughout all the anatomy of your heart in a coordinated rhythmic way to allow the muscle fibers to contract in a coordinated rhythmic way. Okay, so if you've heard about someone needing a pacemaker 99 times out of 100, the doctors are providing a computerized version that can replace the sinoatrial node. That's what's being replaced because it's not functioning properly. Okay, so that's the sinoatrial node. That's the primary pacemaker. The first backup pacemaker is the atrioventricular node, the AV node. Okay. The AV node is located between both the left and right atria. Okay. And this is the first backup pacemaker. Excuse me. So if something's dysfunctional with the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node will try its best to pick up the slack. At least it can pick up the slack long enough to keep you alive till you can get some medical attention. And then there's a third pacemaker, which really isn't called a pacemaker. It's called, well, your book calls it the bundle of conducting muscle cells, but other proper anatomy books call it the bundle of His. Okay, the bundle of His, which is a collection of cells that are located in the septum between the left and right ventricles. And this is the heart's second backup pacemaker. Okay, so Mother Nature figured that it was so important that your heart stay beating properly that she provided triple redundancy here for the heart to contract. Folks, do you have any questions at this time? Okay, I'm not hearing any questions or seeing any questions. So I suppose we will wrap up shop for this afternoon. And let me encourage you, obviously we can't actually hold lab, and it really stinks because the second part of the lab curriculum is actually pretty fun because you do fun things like measure blood pressure and visual acuity on each other, and it's just kind of a fun thing to do, but we can't do it here when we're separated like this. But let me encourage you to keep up with some lab activity reading so you're not caught at the end having to read everything before your next lab exam. Maybe read a lab activity each week and make sure you're keeping up with things. That way it'll be easier for you at the end of the semester. So I'm going to stop sharing and ask you again before we close up, do you have any questions right now about any of the content in chapter 12? Because my intention is on Wednesday to start chapter 13. Okay, I hope you're not passed out on your sofa. So very good. I'm going to take a quick 10, 12-minute break here, and I'll be back online. If anybody needs help, has questions with any content, I'll be happy to help you. Or if you need to chat with me about anything, I'm happy to do that. So I'll be back with you in about 12 minutes. And if I don't see you, stay safe, and I will see you Wednesday. We'll start chapter 13. Have a good day, folks.
All right, you too.